Hello everyone, this is Dan. Today we're going to be talking about virtual geography and locative social networks. First review question, what is virtual? From NMC 260, New Media Futures, you can remember that virtual implies a connection with something more than the device or your perception, but a folding created through your identification with a complex system of meaning. Okay, let me back that off for a second. So when we talk about virtual, we're not just meaning a virtual reality helmet or a story, but the fact that people have a variety of perception extension devices. So we have cellular phones, we do have virtual reality helmets, we have virtual reality gloves, whatever else. But that these systems help us understand both an additional layer of meanings, of signification, and they provide us these technologies that are different. So when we talk about virtual, we're talking about this extension layer that then is tied back to a variety of physical and textual things. So when we say virtual, we mean the unfolding of all of these things with you and how you think about meaning. A key idea to start with is that the map is not the territory. You may have heard this before. I want to go over it again. So what this says is that out there is a territory. There is a physical space that is the Cascades mountain range. You know, real tall mountains, tallest mountains for the most part you'll find in the United States outside of Alaska. They're pretty tall. You can see them from Corvallis pretty effectively. But a map of those, like a territorial map, like a geographic map, doesn't really tell you that much about what the Cascades mean. They don't tell you about the huge cultural differences on the east and west side of those ranges. They don't tell you about the cities and all the other interesting things about the Cascades. And even if you have a map of the Cascades, it probably doesn't tell you all of the things you need to know about them. Now, you might have a map that tells you how to get through the Cascades, but that is probably emphasizing the way to get through the Cascades, and there seems to be one of them, and it's on US 20, and it winds, and it's crazy and everything. So the map itself, though, isn't the territory. It isn't a 100% accurate reflection of all the data that one could possibly glean about things that are in that mountain range. Instead, the map is a representation of a set of pieces of data that could be important in different kinds of situations. And so the map isn't the territory. And keep that in mind as we talk. Second thing we're going to talk about is the idea of locative affordances. So first, locative means things about your phone, your computer, any of your social platforms that tend to be tied to a particular place or space, like coordinates. Like, I'm sitting at 124 by 45 north, so 44 north, which is pretty north and pretty west, way west of Los Angeles. And super north, like as north as Minneapolis, so north of Boston, north of New York, way north of Detroit and Chicago. Those are positively south by the standards of the Pacific Northwest. So that's locative. And affordance, if you remember from Futures and our discussion of systems theory, are capacities that are built into systems. And so we've talked about this pretty extensively in other classes, that an affordance is a capacity, but if it's not marked, people don't know about it. So when I say that a system has a locative affordance, I'm saying that that system has a capacity to use locational information and to use it for some purpose. This will be an important distinction later as we talk about these business models and whether or not they are succeeding or failing or what the future of locative media holds. It is ultimately an affordance. At the same time, though, we'll talk about the idea of location as something more than the coordinates. So first, I want to talk a bit about critical geography. So much like a couple weeks ago when we talked about the idea of history and historical writing practices, geographic practices are also very significant. So I'm a huge air traffic control fan. I love to watch flight radar and sometimes listen to air traffic control radio. And those maps are designed to do a very particular kind of thing. They tell you about flight paths through an area. If you're watching like a live feed of transponder information, they show you the planes and what altitude they're at, and what type they are, and all of that is significant and interesting. But that practice of drawing those maps and picking those pieces of evidence comes not from some way to objectively represent the world, but from an attempt to find the kinds of information that will be relevant for someone thinking about air traffic and to build a map around them. Or to put that another way, when you look at those flight radar websites and air traffic control websites, you're not looking for an objective map. You're not going there because you're interested in maps as much as you are interested in the movement of planes, which is really neat. They go 3 dimensions, they fly over each other, they fly under each other, they go to different places, there are storms they have to fly around. All kinds of interesting ways to think about why things would need to go somewhere. And those would be very different depending on what you're doing. You can also see how you might intentionally skew a map. I have a map from a commercial development company where the map is skewed on the XY axis to make it look like a competing location to one location is a farther distance away than it actually is. I have no idea if this was just simply an error or if it was intentional or whatever else, but by squishing the map, it made the north-south version of it look way farther apart than it actually was. So the way you build a map, the way you lay it out, the way you choose what to put on the map matters for how people use the map and how it shapes their impression of time and space. Consider a Google map. Does that transit geography tell you very much about life and culture and power and history? I mean, a Google map really is just trying to tell you how to use a street grid system. And walking directions are available, but they're not great. And frankly, the transit directions aren't that great. So it's really a map telling you about how to move around in your car. The map is a technology then that coordinates movement, much like a clock is a technology that coordinates activity. Time, and especially time as we know it, according to John Peters, is really a 20th century thing about coordinating activity, which is something I think that's pretty important to think about, in that we're studying then these ways that these layouts and ideas about creativity cause us to move around in particular ways. So the reason why you have a Pierre Levy reading this week, in addition to the Foursquare Wiki is really good, I'll talk about that a little later, is that his research has informed a lot of ideas about participatory culture. Now, if you're interested, Levy is well indebted to Hayek and others, and there are some really interesting implications to all that. Ultimately, a lot of this participatory culture research is starting to have a real 90s throwback feel. At least that's the feedback I get from students in intro and classes where we read that research. A lot of cyber utopianism, radical forms of cyber optimism, that people would invent new identities, they'd make new friends on the internet. Fortunately, Dana Boyd's research and a lot of other platforms of research have confirmed that you don't meet new people on the internet. You meet people who are like you. So Levy is interesting because he's pointing at the idea that there could be autopoiesis. That means that a system could autonomously generate meaning or text. This is different than autotelic. Autotelic means something creates itself. But in this case, we're talking about systems that are self-organizing and systems that make text on their own. The purpose of these ideas was to, and the popularity of this theory, was to give some kind of theoretical vocabulary to talk about the idea of people getting together on the internet to be organized around interests and into interest groups that didn't fit neatly into historical norms or categories. So we're not talking about people in the environmental movement. We aren't talking about civil rights bus riders, groups we could very traditionally study. We're talking about groups that organized for other reasons. So some classic cultural studies objects of research would include shopping or mall culture, all of which are very interesting to me, obviously, but they don't have the same kind of hook, the same concreteness to say that this is a social movement. And on the internet, it gets to be an even bigger problem. How do you deal with a network that ultimately tries to pretend like it's placeless and infrastructureless? These theories, especially about participatory culture and collective intelligence, have been very popular with magazine writers. Look at some Clay Shirky stuff if you're interested in that. And with people around San Francisco who want to believe that you don't need very much structure to make culture go. So the thing that Levy starts this short chapter with is saying that he's going to respond to the concept of collective stupidity. And let's just be very clear, the idea of stupid crowds is really, really old. Public relations, as you know, was invented in the early 20th century. Edward Bernays had a very heavy hand in it. And the idea was that we could use communication technology and psychoanalysis to find ways to keep the mob from forming, so to keep people from becoming passionate and hateful, killing each other. In his classic book, Propaganda, we read a little bit from that in the in-person version of this class. He is pretty convinced that with proper psychoanalytic management, that the stupid, hateful, murderous crowd of humanity, or the American public in the early 20th century, could be changed. They could be improved. Feedback could make them not anti-Semitic, was his specific example in 28. His case study for all of this was the fact that he was really pretty successful at making it socially acceptable for women to smoke, which all of these examples, especially given what happens in the 30s and 40s, and then now, especially now knowing the health problems associated with tobacco smoke, seems really out of place and out of time. But at the same time, this idea of a stupid collective was very powerful in early 20th century politics and early 20th century communication theorizing. And frankly, it was overdone. If you look at Joy Hayes and Kathleen Battle's recent work, if you do any kind of rigorous history, you'll find that there really wasn't a War of the Worlds panic, that it's very much a high school media studies kind of idea, saying people are so stupid they'll get whipped up over a radio broadcast. That night, there was a lot of phone activity. People loved to talk to each other on the phone about what was on the radio. But that the idea of society as a whole gripping onto this one radio play and having a panic is overdone, if only for the purposes of supporting this sort of collective stupidity thesis and the kinds of aggressive management and police power that would be justified by that theory. So his answer, Levy's answer, is to make a distinction between orderly and disorderly systems. So he wants to be very clear from the outset that he's not saying that all systems are self-organizing, but that the way people communicate can result in them having a lot more intelligence and hopefully a lot less stupidity than we might otherwise assume, or that people assumed in the early 20th century. So this qualifies that idea of the autopoietic, to say, if there is a good system, and it is orderly, and the feedbacks are well established, it could generate text and meaning and knowledge on its own, and create a positive feedback loop. We really want to be careful about this idea of well-organized, because it can give this theory both some real explanatory power, but it can also give the theory an inappropriate escape hatch from meaningful criticism. So markets, when they're well-organized, can be very good. And you see paragraphs in there by Levy saying that a totally unregulated market has a lot of problems. Could have Ponzi schemes. A Ponzi scheme is where you take investments from someone with no real investment strategy and give them to older investors or earlier investors. Democracy with good models works pretty well. Canadian parliamentary systems are generally pretty solid. That's the reason why we recommend them, or at least the State Department recommends them so highly. Science, when properly organized, can be a very effective tool. Restaurant reviews. Sometimes that market works out. Sometimes there's positive information flow. The other times, other hand, these systems can be easily gamed, or people will send out restaurant reviews of restaurants that haven't even opened yet. I have no idea if Guy Fieri's restaurant is good, but I could make a joke here about that and restaurant reviews. The idea is that there are atoms of knowledge out there that could join together and make more interesting configurations for molecules. So to say that you as an individual know something about the good food in Seattle. I mean, I really like pierogi. I'm sure there are other people who don't. But at the same time, Seattle's great. And those are some pretty solid Russian pastries. And then I could tell people who don't know that there are solid Russian pastries there to go to the store and buy these Russian pastries. And then they might have things to tell me as well about things that are really cool at Pike's Place or things that aren't a tourist trap around the Seattle waterfront. So then the idea is that an organizational structure could get these ideas together, yet it's a sufficient condition. It's not sufficient, it's a necessary condition. That's the idea from philosophy that says that if something is necessary, it has to be there. So I talk about critical thinking, we talk about the necessary things. So structure is necessary to get, and when being well organized is necessary to go to that next level. So then for Levy and others, where do you get your creativity? A lot of this comes from a reflexive loop, and this is very reasonable given many other models of communication. This assumes that when you interact with other people, you might have symmetrical and reciprocal disclosures, you can fantasy chain together, so you can build more knowledge in a loop. That's a pretty grounded explanation of creativity, in that it says when you get together with people and build associations, you could come up with spontaneous structure. The problem with the reflexive loop is that it doesn't scale well. So when you engage with a few other people, you have the real capacity to build something together in fantasy chain. But as the small group research has meaningfully suggested, once that gets to be more than a few people, that falls apart. A second source then that the V turns to is the idea of Ba. That's a Japanese term that refers to a sort of energy or expertise. This is also known in certain economic theories as tacit knowledge. Now, there may be some tacit knowledge out there, some expert performance. Expert performance is a theory from sports psychology that says that really good players sometimes can't be good coaches because a lot of the things they do to be great players are so deeply internalized that they can't operate as an effective coach because it's just tacit. You can't get it out of their mind. So this Ba force would say there could be some energy from somewhere else that could power up these networks. Now, I don't want to say that this is a pretty deliberate attempt at obfuscating how networks operate, but that there are some unintentional and interesting and positive and difficult to model effects that happen when people get together. Sometimes things just click, and those models and thoughts and processes really can't be then reduced to something we can survey. I think the strongest and clearest way of describing this is to use some of Jörg Simmel's sociology of fashion from the late 19th century and say that it's really a structure-culture dialectic. So cultures form around structures, and structures require cultures. So inside of any organization, there's organizational culture. And if you've studied organizational communication, you've heard about this before. And those cultures can make a structure work. But those cultures oftentimes form around certain implications of a structure. So a hierarchy inside a business can create certain kinds of cultural norms, and then those cultural norms can reinforce the structure, and it goes from there. So they mutually feed upon each other to create stronger and stronger feedback loops. And so this then gives us a variety of ways to talk about people fantasy chaining together, finding special kinds of knowledge or energy from somewhere else, or even just working within a fairly conventional dialectical form that can explain how location can create meaning and energy. In more concrete terms that you get at the conclusion of Levy's article, there are real environments, there are virtual network mechanisms, and there are occasional encounters. So in organizing an online community, you can see that people live their everyday lives in a place, they have the virtual network, and sometimes they get together. So sometimes we have class, other times we don't. We almost always have class, at least in Corvallis. With these online classes, there are some of you who I will never meet, and will never come to Corvallis, and that's okay. But in these very concrete terms, you can see this in case studies. So why do trade shows still happen? If you don't get together with people on a fairly regular basis, the networks start to lose that affective basis, that feeling of friendship that can really help Ba. The Brony communities. Why are there My Little Pony conferences now? So people can build those emotional networks through those occasional encounters that then can make things really go. Those occasional encounters are a really important part of the theory. It can really help us explain a lot of how people interact with each other. This is a critical idea, right? So without some generative framework, without some idea of people getting together, the knowledge culture can never really get going. I think this is a good way to talk about Google+. So Google+ has kind of a cumbersome interface. There's no real affective reason to be there. And the way the Google employees themselves describe it is as a party where everybody just hasn't shown up yet. And I think that is actually the perfect description for explaining why it will never get going. In that a party only gets going when there is enough co-presence and occasional encounter and virtual network for people to want to be there. And without that possibility for co-presence, the network is just a network. You could build an infinite number of social network platforms, program an infinite number of servers. And that doesn't mean we'll have an infinite number of these networks. They're actually quite finite. It's also kind of interesting that Levy isn't that interested in studying each element of his system, of those systems. He's more interested in studying the prospect that the systems could be self-organized. And that helps us also think about the application of the theory, because he's not bogging us down with a number of extra hypotheses or extra theoretical constructs, but with the idea that there could be a positive feedback loop that could exist in a certain kind of space. It's also very interesting that he continues to rely on the idea of occasional encounter. So then you could have debates about this, right? You could talk about the structure-culture linkages. You could talk about the times when the structure and culture get to be out of balance. You could talk about the kinds of knowledge that exist in these communities. Maybe we're not actually dealing with tacit knowledge. Maybe they're dealing with something else. Does this study with ideas about innovation and diffusion? Bill will talk about those in a different class. But there are lots of debates then you can have about the ways that structures organize themselves and what kinds of underlying trellises or lattices or whatever you want to call them that build the structure for communities, and which ones are better and which ones are worse. This isn't just a matter of saying that magic will make a community work, but you can talk about a better and worse way to organize it. In any case, rather than being stable in time or place, when we talk stable in time or stable in family, we're right now talking about common place-based networks. And this then starts to say, is this too thin a context? So if we apply Levy's theory to Facebook, we can already see these powerful affective relationships in place. On Twitter, people really are invested in the idea of the news. Is it enough to say we all go to the McDonald's on 4th Street? Probably not. Is it enough to say we all go to the weird Oregon hippie country fair? That might be enough, but those are two very different things. So, I just want to put one more idea into this concept that the public is or isn't stupid that you get from Levy, which is, have you ever seen a structure-culture dialectic form a positive feedback loop? Or to ask this in a more concrete way, Levy seems really optimistic. Have you seen people get together and positively troll on the internet to make something better? No, Upworthy is not an example of that. That is a company that is really aggressive about using focus groups, not a spontaneous creation of things people do. And BuzzFeed. Don't get me started about the BuzzFeed, but key idea here. I see people talk about this in online forums. They assume BuzzFeed is some kind of census or reflection of user content. It's not. They have offices full of young writers in Los Angeles and New York who constantly come up with new content. BuzzFeed is not, for the most part, a user-generated platform. It's created largely by a group of people hired by a Deleuzian cultural theorist who assumes that people have weak egos that need to be influenced through the creation of artificial signification in lists. Brilliant. Great application of the theory from a class like this, but not an example of a positive feedback loop of structure and culture. Really negative example is the stagnation in Wikipedia editing. People are increasingly not that interested in writing them, editing them, and as some fights about editorship have revealed recently, or in recent years, there are problems. If people aren't involved with the culture, if the culture is not stable, Wikipedia can fall apart. And if there are structural problems, if there are wiki super editors who are on the take, it can really distort what material is there. So we'll talk about Foursquare. So you read that wiki entry from Foursquare's internal wiki. It's based on Zizi Paparcheesi's work on architecture. And so this author sees Foursquare as being a mechanism for coordinating physical connections in space. The key term for that is molecularization. So internal knowledge within a network is knowledge with you and your friends there. External is knowledge being broadcast to someone else about where you go. Few key ideas. They were trying to sample where you were way back when using a button to check in. You have a protected identity, if that makes some sense. So they didn't want to necessarily give all of your information away to everyone on the external side of the social network. It was organized spatially, so you would check in. And it used locative media as its core feature. Now, this check-in feature is an affordance. It is an affordance of an affordance. It is saying to your phone to take a variable that is sitting in your phone API and then send it back to the server with a little tag information on it to get logged in the MySQL database. that is pretty easily replicated. And Twitter and Facebook and everyone else have done that. Which might explain why Foursquare's numbers have never looked good, because it was a pretty easily copied affordance. The idea also of it being a check-in was necessary, as old school phones had really bad batteries, and so if you just had it run a constant GPS transmit to a central database, you would have killed all of your customers' phones. But so, you have a variety of pieces of information to work with there. How do you manage that spatial map? How do you decide what's on the map? How do you decide who's allowed to put things on the map? Where do you buy your map from? Are you making a map with this process? All interesting questions. Protected identity. Do you let people post anonymously? Do you let people trash restaurants anonymously? Do you let people blackmail restaurant owners? All interesting questions. You know, by blackmail I mean, say, give it a 1-star review, walk in and say, give me $50, I'll make it a 5. So those are just general ideas. So Foursquare originally was a service where you'd press a button and check in, and it would give this some external information and more internal information to your friends. The person who checked in the most at a location could become the mayor of it, and by becoming the mayor, some places were willing to give you special deals, but it was sort of a representation that you were the most important person in that locative social network. This then is a form of structure that then could inform the culture of Foursquare users. Now, Foursquare is increasingly begging the question. Recently, they segmented Foursquare as a recommendation service from Swarm, which is now their post-check-in GPS tracking service. But there's the question, right? What happens when Foursquare gives up on agency? Agency is a term meaning your capacity for making meaningful decisions. So by switching from a check-in model to an ambient awareness model, Foursquare has given up on that idea of just pressing the button to check in. And so what does that say when there's no conversation, when it just becomes a thing running in the background? Does that mean that Foursquare has given up on the idea of making a map that is more than just the locations of users? And are users okay with that? Are they okay with losing the sociality in their model so that then Foursquare can make a more efficient thing to sell, that emerging B2B model? I've said this before, generally when a company that's direct-to-consumer switches over to a pretty heavy B2B model, I start to think the company's probably in trouble because they're looking for cash now rather than cash down the road. So why do we have the Maps assignment? Because your experience in Corvallis is unique and interesting, and it ties you together with Corvallis people. And different Corvallis people will have very different ideas about what the city. Some of you are not from Corvallis, will never be here, and will never visit. I mean, I live here, but I didn't grow up here, and I find new things all the time. I mean, it's a strange town tucked between two mountain ranges in a very small valley in northern Oregon. It's different. I've been around lots of parts of the United States. It is different. The awards that we have in a few days will serve as a feedback structure, so you can look at other people's maps, think about the way they visualize territory, and let's see the kinds of layers of signification that exist. Those ultimately are all agency-based decisions. They tell you about how you feel around town. They tell you about how you feel down by the Wacky Mounds. It's really fun, by the way. So here's the conclusion of this presentation for the week. So what I'm trying to get you to do is think about space and place as organizing social experience. And then the bigger question, which is, are these occasional encounters in space and place enough, or even non-existent encounters, to structure a social network? If you think the answer is yes, that might explain the possible success of Foursquare and Dodgeball and whatever else. Key idea there, the CEO of Foursquare has been like the key guy in all of the locative media ventures. So is it enough? If it is, Foursquare might work. If it's not, then it's just an affordance. And if it's just an affordance, then it can become easily integrated into other heavier identities on Twitter or Pinterest or Facebook. I want us to keep Levy's idea about thinking of creativity as an organizational paradigm in mind next week as we start thinking about Pinterest. Because it seems like it's entirely possible that people who sew baby wraps might have a way more powerful identification together and community identity than people who go to the same McDonald's. In which case, this Levy argument could be really compelling for helping us think about how people organize their communities, but not in a geographic way. And then finally, the question for this week, which is presence enough to form a stable network? It seems like it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. Think about that as you do the readings and the activities this week. Next week, we're talking about Pinterest, and that is a whole lot of fun.